Hello and welcome to this recording of a talk given at the ECI conference on nanomechanical testing, materials research and development. Just before this talk was held, the Nobel Prizes of 2024 were announced, and as you may remember, two of them were awarded for the use of AI. And also there's a nice little tool that came about from Google AI, so I uploaded the slides of this talk. And the QR code here given on the title slide is then what this Google AI makes of it as a podcast. It's not the same talk as you will now hear, but it's an interesting approach how an AI based on the material, just given it in the form of slides, can generate such a podcast. Anyway, let's get started. What is AI? Generally, we distinguish between artificial general intelligence that can perform any task on par or better than humans can do, if we do recognize this artificial intelligence as an intelligence, which is by no means certain, but this brings us more into the philosophical area. What we mainly talk about is narrow artificial intelligence, and here we mean a system that is able to perform a specific task on par or better than humans, and this is what we see in many applications, not only material science, but in many application areas. Let's start with comparing the performance of AI with a few select cases. The dashed line at 100% is a human baseline, so this is what we expect from humans to perform, and this doesn't mean average humans, but humans in a given field. For example, image classification, the AI methods have exceeded human performance, at least in some areas, in 2017. As you can see, but we also started from a very high baseline. If we draw attention to language understanding, for example, it's only a very recent field, and you've seen that there's remarkable progress. And in end of 2023, beginning of 2024, we could say that more or less machines can understand language on a level that is comparable to what humans do. Math competition is a very interesting case because here we compare entry questions into math competitions with what humans would do, and you can see that in a very, very short time AI systems have become very, very competitive. Also, AI research is no longer limited to specific fields. Like, for example, material science, you have a very strong field that has matured over decades. But as you can see from publications in Nature like this, Google's DeepMind is also entering that game, of course, not in all areas of material science, but in some specific areas. Outside competitors, shall we say, are able to produce competitive results, at least to some extent. So, what does that mean for a scientist? Game over. Let's turn the question around and say, what can AI do for us? Rather than seeing it as a threat, let's see it as an opportunity. We'll focus on a few examples here. For example, improving experimental methods, and here we focus on nano-indentation mapping and pop-in identification. Large-scale statistical analysis, and here we focus on microstructure analysis, or how to enable new kind of experiments that weren't feasible without using AI methods. Let's start with nano-indentation mapping and face identification. The general workflows is depicted here. So you take your sample, here is an example of a dual phase steel, and you place a large array of nano-indents across the steel. And for example, you want to identify which phases, like martensite or ferrite in this concrete example. So you do your nano-indentation mapping, and then you end up with a hardness map. So you see that you can distinguish visually that there are two phases. This is what we also expect. But you can also see that there are a number of artifacts, right? And to map this hardness to the phases, like for example, martensite or ferrite, you would have to deconvolve this into the different phases. There are two main approaches that we can follow. One is a statistical approach, and there's a sample publication here where this was developed. And we can also follow the machine learning route. And since we talk about AI methods, let's follow the machine learning approach further. There are, of course, a number of established procedures and workflows to do this, and they all follow the same pattern that we've just discussed. Like we take our nano-indentation mapping of the microstructure, get the hardness map, and then deconvolve that into the phases, for example, using a k-means clustering algorithm. When we do that, or when we do any analysis, of course, we have a number of assumptions and prerequisites. in general, we assume that we either have perfect data, which is not feasible really, but we have cleaned up our data before we start our analysis. We also need some dedicated tools to understand the unexpected, shall we say. We need to exclude known artifacts like damage or scratches in the surface or whatever it is. But also the machine learning algorithm itself comes with assumption prerequisites. Like, for example, if we are to use k-means clustering, that means that we have to know the number of clusters beforehand. Either we have expert knowledge about this, or that we sort of tune this and then we have to understand the tuned number. And k-means comes with the assumption of essentially spheroid or circles as clusters because of the way the clusters are formed. So let's take this a step back and really then go through what would really happen. So we take a image of our null indentation to make sure that we sort of have our grid aligned. Say we do this at 5 kilovolts. Now we notice that we have a number of artifacts in there, right? And we need to understand this because, as we just said, we also need to clean up our data before we start in this approach. Right, so for example, we can take an image with a higher accelerating voltage, and then we can look a bit deeper into the material, and we can see that at these areas, which wasn't apparent at 5 kilovolts, but at 20 kilovolts, we can see that at these areas we have underlying damage, and this is what leads to the artifacts in our hardness or elastic modulus map. Right, so the next step is then to clean up our data. For example, we want to only have now the valid measurement points, and say we exclude all those with a very small hardness values, and then we can use our machine learning approach like k-means in this, and then we get our deconvolved map with phase identification. However, right, the origin of nanoindentation in itself was that we want to get smaller and smaller, and we don't want to take all the images all the way again and again and really need to clean up our data manually. So one approach we could take is to make the deconvolution more robust, to avoid this extensive manual cross-correlation between different kind of effects and the cleanup and so on, of course to some extent, right? And one way of doing that is to use a different clustering algorithm, like for example dbScan, that is able to first of all identify regions that belong together, so phases, artifacts, damage types, and so on. And also the clusters themselves don't have to be spherical, right? So for example, we could do one round of clustering to map those phases that sort of belong together because they have similar properties, and that brings us to the images in the middle, right? So we can have one kind of cluster that's like martensit-like in the sense that it has similar hardness values, and you can see that all those damaged sites and a few more that we've discussed previously already in the example are identified automatically. Or we could say we have damage type clusters, right? And you can see that aligns well with what has been excluded in the other phase. Now that we have the martensite clusters, for example, we can say, okay, we want to recluster them because dbScan allows us to have arbitrary shapes, right? We can say that for each cluster now we look at the martensite hardness and see if this is uniform or at least if it's incompatible within the error bands, and that allows us to, for example, also track hardness changes across microstructures if we had something like this, or we can use it as an uncertainty estimation to estimate the volatility or the spread in the numbers between the clusters that we have. Another neat example is a pop-in identification, and here the authors use a neat approach, right? So what you often have in nanomechanical testing are these low displacement strain curves, right? And you can see those pop-ins where they have like this little artifact, I would say, in the curve. And one way of identifying them is to translate this low displacement curve as an image, not using the pixels directly, but using, for example, measurement points at each part, and then use convolutional neural networks to identify whether or not there is a pop-in at a given region. Let's come to the next example, large-scale statistical analysis, and here we focus on microstructure analysis. Why is that important? The challenge is that many properties are inherently stochastic. That affects the microstructure, but also the evolution of damage under stress and strain and many other properties of materials. So that means that we need to look at large areas, and by this we mean like several millimeters squared, and able to make sound conclusions. And of course we could do this manually in principle, but it's very, very labor intensive, and in practice that becomes a prohibiting factor. So let's look at two examples: damage localization identification and microstructure segmentation. Large-scale damage identification is about that we want to identify which types of damages are present and how often each of them occur. The challenge is that if we want to make a statistically sound conclusion about this, we need to look at large areas to be able to sample a relatively large space of our sample. That means we have many thousands of damages, because each damage, as you can see, is about a few micron or smaller. And if you look at a few millimeters squared or larger, that means you'll probably have tens of thousands of damages to look at. The other challenge that we have is that the damage class definition is clear, shall we say, for the textbook cases, as you see here on the right, like martensit cracking, interface decohesion, notch effect, inclusion, and boundary decohesion, where the small black area always indicates the type of damage. However, if you then look at realistic cases in a real material, you find that of course there are these textbook-like cases, but there are also many cases where it isn't quite clear what's happening. And one way of doing this is to look at many and then use a statistical approach to analyze what's happening. And here we use two types of neural networks. And so we take a high-resolution panoramic electron microscope image, then identify damage site candidates. And first we identify the inclusions, and they're separate in the sense that they are much larger than all the other type of damages, as you can see from the illustration on the right as well. And then what we really are interested in is the ductile damage, because inclusion are, at least to a large extent, affected by the manufacturing process. So we really want to understand the ductile damage as we work with the material, and we use a second neural network to identify the remaining 4 damage types. The question is then, does this really work? And one way of doing it, at least once, is compare how well the machine performs against a human. So that means that here, at least once, a human has to go through many thousands of images. And of course, because we already said one of the challenges that the class definition isn't quite clear if you have many in-between cases, so we expect that also humans will have some sort of error if you look at many thousands of them and compare this between different humans, for example. And you will also expect that the machine learning algorithm doesn't perform 100%. But what is very encouraging is that we see that the machine learning algorithm and the human performance are roughly the same, as you can see from the graph, right? From the blue triangles and the orange circle, they are very, very similar. So that means the approach works to the same extent that we would expect from human experts, but the key result is then that it takes about 30 hours of focused work time, so spread out over several days for a human to do this, or we use a machine learning algorithm and it takes a couple of minutes. However, we only considered one plane so far, but damage is of course embedded into the material. So what we really need to look at is the 3D evolution of damage, right? So a single plane is not sufficient, because the damage may appear, for example, different in one layer compared to the next, as illustrated here in this series of images, right? So as the damage goes through the bulk of the material, right, you may, for example, come to the conclusion that you have an interface decohesion in the layer you're looking at, because the martensit islands are only apparent like this in the area X2. However, then if you go deeper, you see that underneath there is a martensit island, so the driving damage type is indeed martensit cracking, but it doesn't appear in the other layers like this, because this island is only visible in a small band in the middle of the damage. So this is why it's very important to look at the damage evolution as we go through the bulk of the material. And only then can we understand what kind of damage type is really present, and also what kind of damage type, for example, is the driving factor between the properties of the material and the strain. The other example that we wanted to discuss is the microstructure analysis in terms of segmentation. So when we look at the microscope image, this is what we see on the left, right? We have a high resolution panoramic image, and embedded in there are the microstructure with damage types or the microstructure in itself. And what we think about, this is what we see on the right, is like the segmented image. We think about the phases, we think about the martensit and the ferret phase and the damage time. So we can see this almost looks like a high level map of a universe, right? So how do we get from the image, go from the image that we see to what we think about? And we investigated here two approaches. One is NNUNet and one is a generative adversarial network GANs, right? And once we have this segmentation of the microstructure, then we can use this in further approaches, like for example area fraction analysis modeling input, in the sense that we can now use this segmented microstructure as input for numerical simulation. We can look at damage properties and so on. The key message that we want to look at is that, again, we need to look at a stochastic analysis, because smallish or small areas are not generally representative, and we need large areas, and this is what you can intuitively see from the image on the right. Already, right, depending on where you look, the microstructure is not uniform. So first of all, how do these methods perform? So we looked at the ground truth, so someone needs to actually sit down and color in the whole microstructure, both for training and then for evaluation. What we found is that both approaches work well. Of course, there are subtle differences in how they behave in specific instances, but you can't say that one is generally better than the other. Then it becomes more of a practical point of view. The NNUNet approach can be almost fully automated and can cover large images, whereas the GAN ensemble method is more customizable and allows you a finer grained control over the setup, and that depends then also on your application, what is preferable. But if you need a method that you can sort of set up and run, then the NNUNet is the most practical. So once we've done this, then we can look at the microstructure analysis, and we want to discuss the example of area fraction, like how much martensit, for example, is there in a given area. And to illustrate the point that this depends on where we look at the local variability, and we do this by dividing our overall image into 9 big squares, as you can see here in the middle. And within those, we take a very small one and a larger one and a larger one and a larger one until you reach size number 10, right? That covers the whole of these 9, and then we sort of look at the spread. So here to illustrate a bit more, everything that's in the following slide with number 1 is a very small area that is then placed in different areas of the microstructure. Number 3 is somewhat larger, and so on. And number 10 is the largest. And the result here is that if you then average over those 9 cases, the mean and the mean is relatively stable, even within the standard deviation, but you get a very large spread. Like for the small squares of number 1, you can see that the blue crosses go from 15 to 50, right? So this is an enormous spread. And even on the other extreme, for the number 10, we can see that even though the areas are now very large compared to manual analysis, we still have a sizable spread. So that means if we want to have a good estimate of our area fraction or any other stochastic property, we really need to look at much larger areas as, for example, even the square number 10. Lastly, we want to look at how AI helps us to enable new experiments. And here we want to focus on automated in situ analysis with super resolution. So that's quite a handful. What does this mean? In many cases, we want to study damage evolution under strain. So that means we have some sort of strain on our sample, then we want to see what kind of damages and how many of them there are. Then we increase the strain, pull on the sample again, repeat the whole process, and do this again and again and again. Right. And as we've just said, damage is a stochastic quantity. So again, we need to look at, to bridge to our first use case, we need to look at several millimeters squared, even preferably larger. The challenges are that, as we had before, the image analysis in itself is very time consuming, and this is not something you can do feasibly manually, especially if you want to look at several samples and do this like repeatedly 5, 6, 7 times per sample, right? So this is time you simply cannot really spend on such an analysis. But also the image acquisition in itself is a lot of an impact factor. It takes very long to take these large-scale, high-resolution images. So here what we want to do is we use the damage localization identification that we've discussed earlier and track the sites of interest. So the general approach is we start with a predeformed sample or with the sample as it is, then take one reference scan in high resolution and look at what we want to follow, and then we deform the sample, do a low resolution scan because this is much faster, and this is now where the AI setup comes in. Now we want to upscale for damage tracking and initial analysis, right? And to make sure that we don't sort of invent features, we can also program the system to track those damaged sites and take high resolution images of those, and then use the machine learning approach and do this in a circle. And this is like the technical setup. We take our electron microscope, and what we want to eliminate is the enormous time that we spend on acquiring the image, because we've already automated the damage identification and classification in the previous example. Right? So we have in this example a low resolution input, and what we want in the end is the generated high resolution, the super resolution image from the AIs that brings us from the low resolution input to the high resolution image. And we do this by using a texture transformer network, and that works by a reference stack, because in the end resolution enhancement is a mathematically ill-posed problem, because generally you can have many different low resolution images that correspond to a high resolution image, or you can view it the other way around. If you have a high resolution image and blur it, right, you can imagine that many different types of low resolution images refer to the same high resolution image. So the idea is then to use these reference images as a, shall we say, curated stack of helpers that guide the network to the most probable output. And this is what the result is. So again, the key idea is we want to use the fast to acquire low resolution images, and then use the AI method to predict the high resolution image from this low resolution image, and the high resolution image is then what we need later for the analysis. And to illustrate the point, we use this steel sample here with this complex microstructure, and here on the left of the illustration you can see that we have a high-res overview. So this is what you can take with the high resolution SEM imaging, right? So that takes a lot of time, and on the right hand side you see the small area again in high resolution. That is what we want to achieve to look at. So you might ask yourself, do we really need AI for this? Because there are many interpolation algorithms on the market already, and this is the second column from the left where we use bicubic interpolation, and you can see that yes, you can sort of upsample, but the quality is not good enough to do any analysis with it. In particular, if you compare this with the last column, the actual high resolution image is very blurry, and the features don't really match, so it wouldn't be good for an AI. And then in the third column you see the AI by super resolution algorithm, and you can see that while not perfect, is very close to the high resolution recording of the SEM image. So this is something that we can actually use for the later analysis. So where does this leave us? Machine learning and AI can act as enablement for material science analysis, right? So this is because many properties are inherently stochastic, and that means we require large-scale image analysis at high resolution. This is the key point, right? So we don't just map in low resolution large areas. We really need, for detailed analysis, high resolution images, and this takes both time and also for materials sensitive to the electron beam may degrade the sample. So we looked at damage localization and identification both in 2D and in 3D, and we looked at microstructure segmentation, characterization, and non-orientation mapping, deconvolution. And in all these cases, machine learning methods and AI can help us to make experiments better, faster, or enable them. And especially in the last point, the next-gen experiment automation, right? So we can move at least parts of the analysis chain into the acquisition cycle and into the microscope control software in itself, so we can use AI methods to better identify, track, and analyze points of interest much faster than we could do this manually. Of course, there are a number of challenges, right? Typically, machine learning and AI methods require large-scale training data, and for example, if you compare it to image data that is often used as a benchmark in computer science, they have 40 million labeled images. That will not really be feasible in material science because we have an enormous range of material compositions and microstructures, so we can't really expect to provide a reference image library, shall we say, of millions of images of every conceivable material and every conceivable microstructure and so on. Right? That is because there are so many of them, that's one reason, but also because the image acquisition is very costly. Right? So you can't just spend the time to do that, and you would also have to label those images, and you need a lot of expertise to do that. Again, if you compare it to ImageNet data, that shows everyday objects like houses, birds, cats and dogs, and you still need a human to do that, to create and curate such a data set, but you don't need a particular expertise, right? So at least for the foreseeable future, such large-scale foundational data sets, shall we say, are not really feasible within the realm of material science. What can we do, though, is to build dedicated AI applications and architectures, right? When we look at what works in material science, what works well in computer science is a good starting point, but it does not necessarily work well for material science because they're optimized typically on libraries like ImageNet data, and that is not really representative of what we do in material science. So we do need to spend a lot of dedicated work on develop algorithms, approaches and workflows for material science. What also will help us to improve research data management in all the labs, and not just publish your paper, and of course that's very important to publish your paper, but also publish the models that you develop, the underlying code, and also publish the data that you have. And maybe from a personal perspective, try to build applications rather than GitHub repos. It's very good that if we publish our models and our code, right? But it's much easier, even within your lab, if you build an application around that so that the next person can start from a working setup on a server and then improve on that. So thank you for your attention.